August 4th, 1964, a U.S. Navy destroyer moves through stormy waters in the Gulf of Tonkin. Radar picks up strange signals. Sonar detects something moving underwater. The crew believes they're under attack. Within minutes, the ship opens fire, launching rounds into the dark sea. But there was a problem. No enemy was ever found. This moment, known as the Gulf of Tonkin Incident, became the excuse to send the United States into a full-scale war in Vietnam. A war that would last more than 10 years, cost the lives of over 58,000 American soldiers, and change the country forever. What really happened that night? Some say it was a misunderstanding. Others believe it was something more, a staged event or a cover-up used to justify war. In this video, we'll take you step by step through the real events behind the Gulf of Tonkin incident. You'll learn what the government knew, what the public was told, and what's been revealed since. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a warning. If you're interested in real stories about war, politics, and hidden truths, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are many more stories like this coming. Let's go back in time, to the months before the gunfire, to understand how it all began. To understand the Gulf of Tonkin incident, we need to go back to the years after World War II. Vietnam had been under French colonial rule, but by the 1950s that control collapsed. The country was divided in two. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh, followed a communist system and was backed by the Soviet Union and China. The South was anti-communist and supported by the United States. America believed in something called the domino theory. The idea was simple. If one country in Southeast Asia became communist, others would quickly follow, like falling dominoes. U.S. leaders feared that losing Vietnam would lead to communism spreading throughout the region. That fear drove the U.S. to support the South Vietnamese government, even though it was weak and unpopular with many of its own people. American advisors, money, and weapons began flowing into the region. Over time, the U.S. got more deeply involved. By the early 1960s, the U.S. was not just helping. It was actively involved in secret operations. One of those was Operation 34A. It involved South Vietnamese commandos, trained and supported by the U.S., making covert attacks along the North Vietnamese coast. These missions were top secret and included sabotage, radio broadcasts, and even small-scale raids. At the same time, the U.S. Navy began DeSoto patrols, intelligence missions using destroyers equipped with electronic gear to eavesdrop on North Vietnamese communications. These ships, including the USS Maddox, patrolled near the North Vietnamese coast, sometimes just outside their claimed waters. From the U.S. point of view, these missions were legal and necessary for gathering information. But from the North Vietnamese perspective, these ships looked like a threat. They believed the U.S. was not only supporting the South, but also preparing to attack the North directly. Tensions were rising quickly. North Vietnam felt cornered. The U.S. believed it was holding the line against communism. Neither side trusted the other. Both were preparing for conflict. In this heated atmosphere, just one small spark could start a fire. And that spark was about to come. It was the middle of summer in 1964. The USS Maddox, a U.S. Navy destroyer, was sailing through the Gulf of Tonkin, just off the coast of North Vietnam. On the surface, it looked like a routine patrol, but in reality, the Maddox was part of a secret intelligence mission. The ship was conducting a DeSoto patrol. Its job was to collect electronic data and monitor North Vietnamese military activity. At the same time, South Vietnamese commandos, supported by the U.S., had been launching attacks against North Vietnamese targets along the coast. These attacks happened just days earlier, and North Vietnam believed the Maddox was helping coordinate them. In the early afternoon of August 2nd, 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats were spotted heading toward the Maddox. The destroyer was in international waters, about 28 miles from the coast, but close enough to make the North Vietnamese nervous. As the boats came closer, the Maddox fired warning shots. The North Vietnamese didn't back off. A short but intense sea battle followed. The Maddox opened fire with its 5-inch guns, and the North Vietnamese boats launched torpedoes. None of the torpedoes hit, but they came dangerously close. The Maddox radioed for help, and fighter jets from the USS Ticonderoga, an aircraft carrier nearby, were launched immediately. The jets reached the scene quickly and attacked the torpedo boats, damaging two of them and forcing the third to flee. The entire clash lasted about 20 minutes. The medics took only minor damage, just one bullet hole. No American sailors were injured. But the message was clear. North Vietnam was willing to fight back. After the encounter, the Maddox pulled back, but not for long. The U.S. command decided to continue the patrols. To show strength, they sent another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, to join the Maddox. Together, they resumed operations in the Gulf just 2 days later. President Lyndon B. Johnson was informed about the incident. He didn't want to escalate things too quickly. Behind the scenes, though, military leaders were preparing for more action. They believed that if another attack happened, the U.S. would need to respond much more forcefully. At this point, no one knew what was coming next. But inside the White House and the Pentagon, some officials began to see the August 2nd clash as an opportunity, a possible reason to increase military pressure on North Vietnam. The first shots had been fired, and while no one had died, the stage was now set for something far more serious. 2 days after the first clash in the Gulf of Tonkin, the USS Maddox returned to patrol, now alongside a second destroyer, the USS Turner Joy. Both ships were under strict orders: continue their mission, watch for threats, and be ready to respond if attacked again. It was August 4th. The weather had changed. The sky was dark, the waves were rough, and visibility was poor. Rain hammered the decks. The sea was restless. In these conditions, even a skilled crew could misread what they saw, or thought they saw. Late in the evening, radar operators aboard the Turner Joy spotted unusual blips on their screens. At the same time, sonar operators reported what sounded like high-speed underwater movement, which they believed were enemy torpedoes. The crew immediately went on high alert. The two destroyers began evasive maneuvers, changing course rapidly and increasing speed. They started firing into the darkness. Dozens of shells launched into empty waters. Some sailors thought they saw flashes in the distance. Others thought they heard engines or detected incoming objects on sonar. But there was no visual confirmation of enemy boats, no radar lock, no physical damage from torpedoes, just radar signals, sonar pings, and confused reports in the middle of a storm. Back on land, communications were chaotic. Messages from the ships were coming fast, full of tension and uncertainty. But they all pointed to the same claim: we are under attack. The information reached Washington within hours. President Johnson and his advisors reacted quickly. They saw this as a second unprovoked attack by North Vietnam, clear proof that the communists were challenging U.S. power at sea. But even as reports reached the Pentagon, doubt was already growing aboard the ships themselves. Captain John Herrick, the commander of the task group, started to question what had really happened. After reviewing the radar and sonar data more closely, he sent a second message that told a very different story. He wrote that the sonar reports were probably false and that freak weather effects could have confused the radar. He even admitted that the crew may have been reacting to their own ship's noises, not enemy boats. His conclusion was simple but critical. Many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. But that message arrived too late. By the time Herrick's doubts were sent up the chain, President Johnson had already made his decision. Publicly, the second attack was confirmed. The U.S. media reported that American ships had been targeted again in international waters. The American people were told this was an act of aggression. Privately, some officials weren't so sure. But the political pressure was high, and the mood in Washington was leaning toward action. That night, Johnson approved retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese targets. For the first time, the U.S. military was openly attacking North Vietnam. What happened in the Gulf of Tonkin on August 4th remains one of the most debated moments in modern history. To this day, no hard evidence has ever confirmed that an attack actually took place. Yet within days, it would be used as the key reason to pass a law that gave the president almost unlimited power to wage war. The morning after the reported second attack, President Lyndon B. Johnson addressed the American people. He told the nation that U.S. Navy ships had been attacked twice by North Vietnamese forces. He described it as open aggression, unprovoked and deliberate. His tone was calm, but his message was serious. The United States could not ignore such acts. Most Americans believed him. Why wouldn't they? The government said it had proof. The media repeated the official story without question. Newspapers and radio broadcasts reported the attack as fact. Behind the scenes, things moved fast. Johnson and his advisors had already prepared a response. They drafted a proposal for Congress, something that would give the president the power to respond to any threats in Southeast Asia without needing to ask for war approval again. It was called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The language was broad and open-ended. It allowed the president to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. That one sentence would give Johnson, and later Nixon, the authority to carry out a massive war. On August 7, 1964, just 3 days after the second incident, Congress passed the resolution with overwhelming support. In the Senate, only 2 members voted against it, Wayne Morse of Oregon and Ernest Gruening of Alaska. Both warned that the resolution would give the president too much power and could lead to full-scale war. They were right, but almost no one listened. In the House of Representatives, the vote was unanimous, 416-0. Johnson now had what he wanted: the legal power to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam without needing to go back to Congress. A few hours later, American aircraft were bombing targets in North Vietnam. It was the first major use of force, but it would not be the last. At this point, there were only a few thousand U.S. military advisors in Vietnam, but now the door was open for tens of thousands more. America was moving from behind-the-scenes support to active combat, and it all started with an attack that may never have happened. After the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed, the United States moved quickly from limited support to direct military involvement in Vietnam. At first, President Johnson promised that he didn't want war. He told the public that the resolution was only meant to protect American forces and prevent future attacks. But behind closed doors, U.S. military leaders were already planning the next steps. In early 1965, the situation in South Vietnam was getting worse. The Viet Cong, communist fighters operating in the South, were growing stronger. The South Vietnamese government was unstable, weak, and losing control in many areas. U.S. advisors were reporting that without help, the South might collapse. On March 2, 1965, the United States launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a major sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. It was meant to weaken the North's ability to support the Viet Cong and force them to negotiate. But it didn't work as planned. The bombing only made the North more determined. It also caused more civilians to suffer, and it helped the Viet Cong recruit new fighters. A few weeks later, the first U.S. combat troops landed in South Vietnam. These were not just advisors, they were regular soldiers, ready for battle. By the end of 1965, there were over 180,000 American troops on the ground. By 1968, that number would grow to more than 500,000. The war expanded rapidly. U.S. forces fought in jungles, mountains, and rice fields. They used helicopters, airstrikes, and search and destroy missions. But the enemy was hard to find. The Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics, hiding, striking fast, and disappearing. The North Vietnamese army also joined the fight directly, moving troops and supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a hidden supply route that ran through neighboring countries. Back home in America, the mood began to change. At first, most people supported the war, but as casualties increased and the fighting dragged on with no clear progress, the public grew uneasy. Young men were being drafted to fight in a faraway place. Television news showed graphic images of combat and death. Protests began to grow on college campuses and in major cities. Many Americans started asking, why are we really in Vietnam? By the late 1960s, the war had become a national crisis, not just on the battlefield, but in American homes, schools, and streets. Trust in the government began to erode. People started questioning whether the war was based on truth or on lies, and it all traced back to a stormy night in the Gulf of Tonkin, an event that gave the president a blank check for war, even though no one could say for sure what had actually happened. For years, the Gulf of Tonkin Incident was accepted as fact. 2 attacks on U.S. Navy ships, 2 clear acts of aggression. That was the story told to Congress, the media, and the American public. But decades later, documents were declassified, reports were unsealed, and the truth became much harder to ignore. The August 2nd attack, the first one, really happened. The USS Maddox did engage with North Vietnamese boats, but what many people didn't know at the time was that the U.S. had been helping South Vietnamese forces launch covert attacks along the North's coastline just days earlier. So to the North Vietnamese, the Maddox wasn't just spying, it looked like part of those attacks. The August 4th attack, however, is a different story. When the National Security Agency, NSA, finally released its classified report, it revealed something shocking. There was no actual second attack. Radar and sonar signals had been misinterpreted. Bad weather, high seas, and nervous operators created confusion. No North Vietnamese boats were ever confirmed in the area. Even worse, some officials inside the U.S. government knew this at the time, but chose not to say anything. Intelligence reports that showed doubts about the second attack were either ignored or buried. The White House went forward with a public message of certainty. In 2005, the NSA's own historian called it a case of skewed intelligence. The agency had picked out the details that supported an attack and left out the parts that didn't. As a result, Congress and the public were misled. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a moment where facts were shaped to fit a decision that had already been made. Over the years, several officials admitted that the incident had been misrepresented. One of them, former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, later said he believed the second attack never happened and that the war might have been avoided if the truth had come out sooner. But by the time these truths were made public, the war had already cost millions of lives, American, Vietnamese, and others. The Gulf of Tonkin incident is now seen as a warning. It showed how fear, pressure, and politics can lead to war, even when the facts are unclear. And it raised a difficult question. How do we hold leaders accountable when the truth comes out too late? The Gulf of Tonkin incident left a mark far beyond the waters of Vietnam. It didn't just lead to war, it changed how Americans viewed their government, their military, and the truth. Once the public learned that the second attack likely never happened, trust in leadership began to fall. People started asking hard questions about other wars, other decisions, and other official stories. The government had used a single unclear event to start a conflict that lasted more than a decade. Over time, this led to real changes. In 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act. It was designed to prevent any future president from sending troops into combat without approval. The goal was simple. Never again should one person have so much power based on uncertain facts. But even with new laws, the lessons of Tonkin continue to echo. Politicians and military leaders are still tempted to act quickly, especially in times of fear or crisis. And the public is often left with limited information, forced to trust official reports. That's why Tonkin still matters today. It reminds us that truth can be delayed, but the consequences come fast. It shows how a single moment, one misread radar signal, one rushed decision, can affect millions of lives. And it teaches us that asking questions, even in times of war, is not disloyal, it's necessary, because the cost of silence can be far greater than the cost of doubt. The Gulf of Tonkin incident wasn't just a moment in history, it was a turning point. A possible mistake, misunderstood in the chaos of war, became the trigger for one of the longest and most costly conflicts in American history. It's a powerful reminder that wars aren't always started with clear facts. Sometimes they begin with confusion, pressure, and decisions made too quickly. More than 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. Millions of Vietnamese lost their lives, and many more came home wounded, both in body and in mind. All of it tied back to one night in 1964 when something was seen or imagined on a radar screen. Today, the Gulf of Tonkin stands as a lesson. Question everything, especially when lives are on the line. Ask for the truth. Demand evidence. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And Tonkin reminds us what happens when we stop asking questions. Thank you for watching this video. If you learned something new today, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future deep dives like this one. There are more forgotten stories to uncover, and we're just getting started.